who are called the people of the river, and I'm very grateful for their stewardship of this land and of the river. So I want to start today with this sloth. First of all, because I love sloths and I think they're really cute, but also because this is my kind of main point today as we talk about trauma. So you may be here, maybe you yourself are a person who's experienced some kind of trauma, or maybe you want to learn about it, or you're supporting people that have trauma. And I want to just start off by saying you are not lazy. The reason I want to emphasize this is because I work with a lot of students who are facing challenges, and they come and chat with me, and this is just such a common kind of interpretation of their experience. So I meet students, and they just, when they're facing challenges, they will say, I guess I'm just lazy. And so I want to say to you that this is a myth. So, although we all feel lazy sometimes, no one is a lazy person. The question is really, what is holding you back from forward movement? And trauma is one significant reason. And so I want to share with you today some of the possible ways you might be impacted by trauma in your learning, or someone you know or support is impacted by trauma in their learning. So we're going to talk about some of those impacts, and then we're going to also look at strategies. And I think it's just really helpful because what I find is a lot of people don't really realize, they maybe realize that their trauma is causing an emotional experience for them, but they may not actually understand the full impact it's having on how they navigate learning. And so I don't want it to be depressing. I want it to be hopeful for you. And so my message for you is you are not lazy. You don't need to just work harder. It's not that there's something wrong with you. It's that there are different things that are going on for you in your learning. So I hope that this will be encouraging and helpful as you get to know maybe this part of your learning journey better. And I want to also start off with a little bit of a disclaimer, in that all trauma is not equal. There are many different kinds of trauma. We're not here to talk about your traumas. And although normally I really enjoy an interactive session, because this is a sensitive topic and it's very personal, you're definitely welcome to, of course, put things in the chat. And I invite you to also unmute and speak anytime. I'm very informal. So feel free to ask or add something to the conversation. But I do want to be sensitive to where you might be coming from. And so we're not talking about specific traumatic experiences that you might have had. We're looking at the impact on learning. But first, it's just important to define trauma because it's a word that unfortunately is now kind of thrown around and almost has become an empty word because it's overused. But these are kind of the four or the three main categories of that we might look at with trauma. And there's uh, innumerable research studies that help us to understand how different types of trauma may have different impacts. So, first of all, you might have heard of the term ACEs, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So, this is a concept that refers to significant disruptive experiences in childhood. So, that can include things like family instability and divorce, or it can include things like violence and many, many more. Um, there's a lot of research on how these experiences disrupt normal childhood development. They can change the very architecture of your brain and even change your genes, which is called epigenetics. So, adverse childhood experiences have very significant and long term impacts on a person. When a person is immersed in this kind of ongoing traumatic experience in their early days, it becomes like a toxin in the brain and body, and it changes the physiology of a person. So that is a very different kind of trauma from experiencing a single event. And also experiencing a single event, like maybe an accident, in childhood will be different from experiencing a traumatic event in adulthood because once you're in adulthood, you're not experiencing developmental changes the way you are as a child. So I am not a neurobiologist. And I am not a psychotherapist. I'm not bringing those perspectives into this presentation. I am a learning expert, and so I'm bringing in the learning lens, but looking at how this kind of experience you have might affect you, but it might affect each of you differently. It might affect you at different times and in different ways. And so I don't intend for any of the things I want to share with you to be kind of like blanket or overgeneralization. So, first, I'll look at a few different ways in which trauma can impact your learning and give a few examples for you. So, because trauma affects your brain and your body, you might experience some cognitive differences. So, that means your thinking, the way your brain works. So, especially when you face the pressure of academic demands, when you're in a college or university context, there's a lot of demand on you. So, you might find that your cognitive load becomes smaller. Cognitive load refers to how much your brain can hold on to and process. So you might find that it becomes difficult to do multiple assignments, plus make other decisions about your daily life, even things like what to eat in the day. It might be that you just feel too full in your brain. And we all have this experience, but for a person who's experienced trauma, the cognitive load tends to be a little bit lower than in a person who has not experienced trauma. So, what I want to say is that what looks like procrastination is in fact your brain protecting itself. It's something that you've experienced as a way of kind of capping out what you can handle and protecting yourself from stress. So trauma can also reduce your ability to see and understand causes and effects, to perceive and respond to possible consequences. What does this look like? Well, you might know that an assignment is worth 20%, but you might not fully understand the consequences of not handing it in. Or maybe you finish an assignment, but you feel too anxious to click that submit button. You know it's due, you know the rules of the course, but your brain just doesn't put together the significance of that consequence. And so it may lead to a lot of, late assignments or forgetting to hand things in, that kind of thing. So this means that common motivations like giving yourself rewards, which is very common for a lot of people, maybe you say, okay, after I finish so many pages of this assignment, or I finish doing this reading, I'm going to reward myself with, a cup of tea or something like that. But that kind of reward system typically doesn't help with strategies when you are impacted by trauma. So trauma can also make it difficult for you to put your thoughts together and to express your thoughts with language. And this has become because trauma causes disorganized thinking and interferes with language. So sometimes you might not be able to verbalize your answer even at all. Maybe you've had an experience like this when someone sort of asks you a question or says something to you, and you are literally not able to speak. I don't know if that's happened to you, but students have explained to me that that has happened to them sometimes, and it causes a lot of distress and distress for the other person as well. But for you to know that it's not because you're not working hard enough, or you're not good at language. It's your brain again trying to pull together the thoughts that are maybe a bit disorganized, and it's going to take you a little bit more time. Another way that trauma impacts your cognition is in your capacity to imagine. So think of all the things we can do with imagination. I don't just mean, okay, I'm a big fan of Anna Green Gables, so I'm a big fan of dramatic imagination and creativity and art. So I don't just mean imagination in that way, but the idea, imagining is the ability to hold on to something that's hypothetical, something that's not in your current physical experience. So if it's difficult for you to engage in imagination. It might be difficult for you to understand consequences, like we've talked about. It might be difficult for you to imagine kind of future scenarios or what ifs. Any kind of hypothesizing, and even things like case studies, which are hypothetical situations, might become a bit more difficult for you to engage in. So I'm going to pause right there just for maybe 1 minute to give you just some quiet for you to think about in your own experience or maybe in the experience of someone that you know. Have you seen or experienced some of the ways we've just been talking about? Okay, we're going to move on to the next way in which trauma impacts learning, and that is in the emotional area. So, when the emotion focused work of the brain and the biological processes, which are all part of your limbic system, so when these are activated, when your limbic system is activated, this closes down or overrides the rational functions of your brain. And so these are some of the things that you might experience if you are kind of flooded with emotions related to trauma. So, the limbic system plays a critical role in the formation of memories and the emotional associations that get attached to these memories. And that's a quote from Shanker, who wrote a book called Self Reg. And you'll see that in the references at the end. So, the limbic system, in other words, draws out things that we would rather not relive or we would rather not remember. And these are sometimes what people call triggers. So, in the context of learning, in an academic context, your brain might attach the feeling of a threat to things that are stressful. So, in other words, your brain is perceiving stress and your brain is attaching that feeling of stress to a previous memory, and that's your trauma trigger. And so some things might not actually be threats, like attending class or handing in a paper. These things are not themselves threats, but you may experience them that way. And so your brain then senses stress and might associate that with shame and with those personal traumas. And that might cause you to kind of shut down. So to have a fight, flight, or a freeze response in that moment. You might also have had weird trauma responses that seem to come out of the blue. This is something a lot of students do describe to me, and it's confusing for them to have these experiences. So, some things you can anticipate, like you might know that, okay, if you are asked to read an article or engage in some kind of learning on a topic that is touching on your own traumatic experience, you might know that this is going to be hard for you. But sometimes it's just that you're going about your normal day and all of a sudden you have a trauma response. And so when that happens, again, it's your emotion and memory are bound together, and so it's not a rational kind of experience. And this then shuts down your rational behaviors and prevents you from doing schoolwork during that time when you're having that kind of response. So you may have had days like that when something is particularly emotional for you. Also, many students that I've worked with describe suddenly closing down, going blank, or not being able to give an answer, or even to respond with a nod or move their body. Some people explain this as that they just kind of go away from their body, and they leave their body behind. And this is a concept called dissociation. It's basically your brain responding to that perceived threat or that memory. So when you have an experience like this, it can leave you feeling exhausted and fatigued. And so, again, that's going to be a difficult thing for you to just kind of continue on your day with. So, I think it's important to recognize these things might be happening and they might be creating barriers for you. But as we go on today, I hope you can see that there are hopeful ways forward as well. Another thing I wanted to point out here is avoidance. So there's a lot of research in trauma that has identified avoidance as a very common strategy. So when you face the demands of doing something that is maybe like beyond your current coping level, maybe over your cognitive load for this time, that the natural response is to just avoid it. So maybe you don't go to class or you just don't look at your assignment because it's just too difficult. It's too much to handle. So although you might not want to avoid doing an assignment, you might end up doing so as a coping mechanism for that stress. So again, I want to say to you, you're not lazy. It's that you're working against things that are creating difficulties for you. So I'll pause there as well, and just for a moment to give you some quiet to just think about whether you've experienced or seen these kinds of emotional responses. Okay. Moving on, another way that you might experience the impact of trauma is this concept of self-regulation. I just mentioned one of the researchers named Schenker, whose book is called Self-Reg, and it has a lot of really helpful ways of understanding what this looks like and how it behaves and how you can actually work towards better self-regulation. So I really recommend his book. So our management of internal regulation in our bodies. So that is even something like your immunity, but also your body temperature, your hunger, your sleep, so many things. It's actually about our attunement to our bodies. And it operates actually independently from other parts of the brain. When we are not well regulated in ourselves, this also can shut down the rational responses. And when we experience something we see as a threat, that our body perceives as a threat, it can also be part of that shutdown process. So trauma can make your brain kind of like a super sensitive smoke detector. So, it's doing its job because it's looking for threats and it's looking for, the need to alert you to something, but it's doing that too often, too quickly, too sensitively. And so it ends up causing you to be dysregulated at times when maybe other people wouldn't feel that way. So here I want to recognize if you're experiencing that, it's not because you're just a, oversensitive person. It's because trauma has this effect on your regulation. So you might respond to this through a hypo or hyper state. So hypo is slowing down, shutting down, or hyper is becoming like emotionally heightened. And sometimes you can get stuck in that state, and that becomes a more long-standing, maybe mental health challenge that you might be facing. So anyway, basically self-regulation is your ability to be attuned to yourself, to sense how your body is interacting with the environment. And so because trauma interferes with this process, as a result, you might struggle to process some things that are involved in regulation. So these are things like time, language, information, and the details of the world around you. And so this affects some of the things that here are on this slide, like remembering your appointments, remembering your due dates, keeping focused. And as I mentioned before, the common motivations that other people might find helpful as study strategies might not be as helpful for you because of this. And so it might be much more difficult for you to do something like planning ahead. And so because of this, I want to say it again, you're not lazy. It's not that you're not trying hard. It's not that you just need to work harder and it's your problem for not working hard enough. The challenges that you might face in planning and managing time and understanding yourself are parts of your learning journey. So, okay, it might feel like, okay, well, Melinda, this is kind of a downer, and I don't want to leave it on a downer. And so, but what I find, a lot of students don't realize all of this is happening, and it really helps them to understand themselves, and then to be able to try new strategies that can be maybe more successful than some of the more traditional strategies. So I want to shift into strategies now, and I'm also watching the time, and we may not get through everything in our half hour. But strategy number one is safety. So your brain and body are seeking safety, and safety is your foundation. So the most important strategy of all for you is to identify people, places, and even things that might make you feel safe. So when you're studying, seek out a place or a person or a thing that will help you feel safe. So you might choose to like sit somewhere close to, like in the proximity of somebody that makes you feel safe. So you're not going to like stalk somebody, or you're not going to be, always bugging the same person to study with you, but maybe it's just to be nearby, to think about where, for example, here I am sitting in the library at my university, which is where my office is, and we have many of our staff from our Learning Commons here as well. And so sometimes students choose to sit in a table, a study area nearby their academic coach, or a person that makes them feel cared for and safe. So maybe there's a place at your university or in your home or wherever you are located where you feel safe. Or opposite to that, maybe there's a place or a person that makes you feel unsafe. And so managing your safety is one of your best strategies, because when you're feeling unsafe, all of those responses we talked about are heightened. But when you feel safe, they're improved, and this gives you advantages for moving forward in your studies. The next strategy I want to talk about is choice. And so a feeling of having no choices, a feeling of being stuck, can stir up a trauma response. It's often related. Something you've experienced has been very traumatic because you lost control or you did not have a choice in that situation. And so it's part of your safety experience to also feel like you are not stuck. So I encourage you to look at situations from the perspective of your choices. So maybe for you, it might be helpful to work on this with a counselor or with an academic coach or a learning expert that can maybe talk through these with you and help you to reframe your experiences as choices. Or maybe you feel like it's okay, you can do this more quietly and reflectively on your own. But for example, okay, you can't choose, well, I suppose you could, but it wouldn't be good to just choose not to take a midterm. The midterm is there. But what you can do is think about, well, what choices do I have before the midterm and after the midterm? What are some choices I have for how to prepare, for where and when to study, for strategies to use for that? And also writing these down can help you to feel a little bit more in control because they become a little bit more concrete for you. So I encourage you to think about maybe a journal or something where you can write down your choices each day. Another strategy is time. Obviously, we can't control time, but we can understand the way we are like interacting with time. So since it might take you longer than some of your friends to complete your assignments because of the things we talked about, rather than like telling yourself, well, I'm not good enough, my friends can do this in 2 hours and it's taking me like 20. Um, that's being hard on yourself. And so I encourage you to be gracious to yourself, to recognize that by giving yourself more time, you are reducing that stress response and you are entering into a more gentle environment for yourself. So to be gracious with your time. I also encourage you to seek out a learning expert who can help you maybe map out your week. What are the different things that you need to do, and how can you maybe break down some of the assignments or some of the things that you feel overwhelmed by, into smaller little steps so that it becomes something you feel like you can understand the time better and you can engage with your body in time in a more like gentle way. The fourth strategy I want to highlight is routine. So routine is healthy for all of us. It's something that I think a lot of psychological research has identified, this kind of rhythm of the day. And I know it's really hard to have great routine when you're a student, and you might prefer to sleep sometimes rather than keep up with some of the other parts of a routine. And so what I encourage you to do is have a schedule, have like a weekly schedule where you include your homework blocks and your exercise and things like that. But don't stick to those too rigidly because things change, things happen. The power goes out, or there's a snowstorm, or your class is canceled, or whatever. And so if you are too rigid about routine, it can kind of be the opposite where you feel stuck. But rather make a healthy routine. And what I would encourage is to keep 2 or 3 anchors in your day. And by anchor, I mean like a couple of things that are not really negotiable for you, that help you to kind of always have those. So for me, that's like at breakfast every day, I read a little bit of a novel. And that's something I look forward to. That's something that like cements me into my day. And then at the end of the day, after dinner, I always take a walk, unless it's really storming. But generally speaking, I take a walk. And these are my 2 anchors that even though other things might not be as well controlled in my day, these 2 things I can predict, and the predictability will give you a sense of safety. And so we've kind of run out of time, and I'll just highlight for you then the final strategy very quickly is the idea of reframing. And this is the idea of changing the way you look at something. So it's going to be inevitable that you make mistakes. You maybe get a bad mark on a test, or you have a negative experience with a classmate, or even with a professor or somebody in your university experience. This is going to happen. And so instead of internalizing this as shame or blame, or externalizing it as blame of, the professor made the test too hard, but practice reframing your behavior or your experience of something. So you're not seeing yourself as a victim, or you're not seeing yourself as being lazy and, having bad self-control, but instead you are looking at how might this be caused by or interacting with different things so that you're not in that stuck kind of framework. And so to do this, you might keep a journal or some other way. I want to recognize not everybody is a verbal person, maybe sketching or even just reframing by a walk and talk might be a good practice for you. But thinking about your behavior in different ways will be a way for you to develop self-regulation and begin to overcome some of the barriers that might be there for you in your learning. And so the last slide I won't comment on. It's just from the book I've mentioned called Self-Reg, and Shanker mentions 5 steps that can help build self-regulation. And his book is essentially unpacking these 5 steps. So if you're interested in knowing more, that's a book you can find. You can order it online, or you can probably find it in your library. And so there are references here. There are lots and lots of research articles and books to do with trauma, all kinds of different angles on it. Not as many are about learning, but there's more and more being done in neurobiology. So if you're interested in understanding your experiences more from that perspective, there's definitely plenty to be learned. And what I wanted to highlight in my references is kind of towards the middle, Andrew Huberman. There's a podcast that he does just called Huberman Lab Essentials. And he has a lot of really interesting, they're very, very long, long podcasts, but he has a lot of interesting discussions that might help you as you consider how to increase your motivation and understand in this journey that you're on, what are some strategies that you can do to improve your brain and improve your sense of safety and choice. Ah, there we go. So that's the end. And thank you so much for joining me. I'm sorry that we got off a little bumpy, but the in the chat I see Andre has mentioned that childhood trauma and long-term symptoms sound a lot like lead poisoning. Yeah, it is a little bit like that. But the good news is that there is hope, and there are ways to become more agile and more comfortable with who you are, and to accept who you are and appreciate who you are in your journey of learning. So if you have any questions, I'm here and I'm happy to stay and chat with you. If you want to email me, you're welcome to do that as well. My information is in the session. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a great afternoon or evening from wherever you are in Canada. Bye for now.